The time between the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War are often referred to as the Long Peace or Pax Britannica. These names refer to the relative peace between European great powers during this time frame. Of course, there were still plenty of wars, especially outside of Europe, but within Europe, wars were now more contained between the participants when compared to the eras before and after. This leads us to the question, how would Europe have looked if this great peace had never happened? So the first thing we need to ask is, what caused this great peace? Perhaps the biggest factor is the sheer shell shock of the Napoleonic Wars. There had just been about 30 years of ideological struggle, war and bloodshed. The statesmen who witnessed it all wanted to avoid another similar European struggle for supremacy. To this end, the powers of Europe agreed upon a peace treaty at the Congress of Vienna, the main architect of the peace treaty being Metternich of Austria. This peace secured a relative balance of power between the European great powers, hopefully preventing a future war in Europe. The European great powers came to the Congress with several goals. France, recently defeated, simply sought to ensure that the other great powers didn't take too much from the defeated nation, and ensure that France remains a great power in the post-war world order. Russia wanted to annex Poland. Prussia wanted to expand in general. Britain wanted to prevent France from rising again by surrounding it with stronger powers, and Austria wanted to create a general balance of power in Europe to prevent massive wars in the future. So, 4 of the 5 nations had their goals pretty much aligned. France remaining a great power was good for balance. Prussia expanding to better counter France and Russia was good for balance. So, Britain and Austria could support both in their goals. But the major troublemaker of the Congress was the Emperor of Russia, who demanded all of Poland, only backing down and accepting compromise when most of the great and minor powers opposed this claim. After this incident over Poland and a couple other disagreements were hammered out, this map was produced as the new map of Europe. It was a true masterstroke of balance and diplomacy. The Netherlands and Sardinia-Piedmont now stood between France and future expansion. Prussia and Austria jointly led the minor German states in a military alliance, binding Germany together against potential French or Russian aggression. Italy was firmly put under Austrian influence, and Russia had few places to expand into that wouldn't lead to conflict with the enlarged Prussians or Austrians. Britain looked upon this map and knew that it was good. This map would secure the relative peace on the continent, and it would conveniently ensure that none of the continental powers could stand up to Britain. So how do we prevent this map and the long peace that it ensured? Well, we prevent the peace deal at Vienna. We will have Russia absolutely refuse to back down from their absolutist position over Poland. In our own timeline, Russia and Prussia had made a deal that gave Russia all of Poland in exchange for Prussia taking all of Saxony. In our timeline, this deal fell through thanks to the other great powers uniting in opposition. In this alternate scenario, we will propose that Prussia and Russia together pushed through their agreement without consent from the other great powers. Despite Austrian, French, and British diplomatic efforts and complaints, Prussia and Russia stand firm in their annexations. Would this immediately lead to another war on the continent? Unlikely. France was just defeated, it barely had a standing army, and it had just lost a massive amount of fighting-age men in the Napoleonic Wars, while Austria stood isolated and Britain was a boat trip away. Meanwhile, Prussia and Russia were 2 of the most militarized states on the continent, with troops all across Central Europe and France. There would be little appetite for starting a new war between Prussia and Russia on one side, and France, Austria and Britain on the other. So instead, thanks to Prussian and Russian actions, the Congress of Vienna practically fails. Instead of the Great Deal at Vienna, the war would end with several individual treaties between the powers themselves. I cannot predict the full details of this peace deal, but here are some suggestions. France could potentially be pressed by the Russian and Prussian occupiers to reluctantly agree to the Saxon and Polish annexations. Austria eventually signed some form of treaty discrediting but accepting the Prussian annexation of Saxony in exchange for the return of the Austrian Netherlands. Without the Congress, there is little reason for this land to be granted to the Dutch, so Austria would want to prevent the land from falling under French or Prussian influence in the future. Crucially then, the Holy Roman Empire was now gone, and there would be nothing to replace it. The German Confederation of our own timeline was a product of the Congress of Vienna, and with the Prussians and Austrians now distrustful of each other, there is little chance of them agreeing upon some new, joint confederation. Most minor German states would align themselves with Austria, as Prussia would be seen as an unjustified aggressor for unilaterally taking the whole Saxon kingdom without justification. But perhaps the most important thing that has changed is that the precedent of the Congress of Vienna, the precedent of peaceful great power diplomacy, is not established. War and military force remain how diplomacy is primarily done. Then finally, the partnership between the great powers against future liberalism and revolutions is not established. The Congress of Vienna, apart from securing the balance of power between the great powers, also sought to ensure that the continent remained ruled by conservative monarchies. Crucially, this also prevents the alliance between Prussia, Russia and Austria. And then, in 1815, Napoleon makes a slight return. Even with the now discredited great powers, there is no chance that Napoleon wins this round too. Even if Britain by themselves opposed the return of Napoleon, Napoleon would eventually be defeated. France was simply too exhausted. In our own timeline, diplomatically speaking, the return of Napoleon changed very little at the Congress of Vienna. This would be different in this alternate timeline, where diplomacy had already broken down. It is very well possible that Austria, Prussia and perhaps even Sardinia-Piedmont take small bits off of France to strengthen their own positions in Europe. So now the map looks something like this. Britain looks at the entire continent in distrust, eyeing Russia up as a potential new superpower seeking to dominate the continent. But with Austria and Prussia bickering against each other, there is little that Britain can do about it. The initial alliances would be Austria, France and Britain against Russia and Prussia. But for the initial decades following the war, peace would remain, as the great powers are still exhausted from the war and they are fully aware of the tense distrust between the great powers. Austria would come out of the war as the informal protector of the German states against Prussia and the Italian states against France, standing as the diplomatic centerpiece of the new European order. Prussia is significantly weaker in this scenario, as while they gained more land in Saxony, they lost Posen and a lot of rich lands in the Rhineland, which they received in our own timeline. Russia is a slight bit bigger in our own timeline, but they are being watched distrustfully by all the other great powers. Then, during the 1820s, there would be many revolutions and uprisings against the new post-war order. In our own timeline, this was dealt with mostly by the coalition between Prussia, Austria and Russia. In this alternate timeline, this wouldn't happen. The revolutions in Italy are dealt with by Austria, increasing Austrian influence in the Italian peninsula. As the Greeks rise up against the Ottomans, the great powers would use this opportunity to weaken the Ottomans by helping the young Greek state achieve independence. During the 30s of our own timeline, Catholic Belgium broke free from their Protestant Dutch overlords. This wouldn't happen in this alternate scenario, since the Belgians are now under Catholic Austrian control. This could very well mean that Belgium never exists in this scenario. In the meantime, France would have the Bourbons overthrown again in this decade, while Austria keeps crushing unification revolts in Italy. The distrust between Austria and France keeps growing over Italy, and all of Europe now looks at France with distrust after the overthrow of the Bourbons. And then, in the 1840s, we have the world order suddenly explode. The past couple of decades were mostly peaceful, despite the failure of the Congress of Vienna. But then we have 1848, which in our timeline was the year of revolutions across Europe. This wave of revolutions may happen a bit sooner or later, but it would likely still rock this alternate Europe. France suddenly becomes a republic again under Louis Napoleon, who would later seek to become king. Meanwhile, German revolutionaries would attempt to unify Germany, although they would fail, as Prussia and Austria both oppose the unification unless it's in the exact way that they determine. But the weakest link in this alternate European system, despite how impressive they look on the map, are the Austrians. In 1848, Austria was facing a tough time, as German revolutionaries were calling for unification, but Austria, with its multi-ethnic empire, could not answer this call. Meanwhile, the Austrians were fighting a war against Sardinia-Piedmont and Italian unification revolts, likely supported by France. And to make matters worse, Hungarian revolutionaries came extremely close to collapsing the Austrian Empire. In our timeline, the Austrians were saved by timely intervention by Russia against a liberal Hungarian uprising, since Russia wanted to protect their conservative ally in Austria. In this alternate scenario, it is highly likely that Russia doesn't send troops into Hungary, meaning that Hungary could very well manage to break the Austrian state. And with the loss of Hungary, Austria would suddenly be in great trouble. Austria is at the center of the action. Austria is standing in Prussia's way of expansion into Germany, while also blocking French influence into the Low Countries and Italy. With Austria declining and trouble in Hungary rising, France could very well attempt to use the revolution in Italy as a way to increase their own influence in northern Italy, perhaps by attempting to establish a federal Italian state under French guidance. Meanwhile, Prussia would assert itself as the new guarantor of the German states, as the German states now lacked protection against future French aggression, allowing Prussia to expand both their borders and their influence across the minor German states. And so, thanks to the Hungarian Revolution, the entire fabric of this timeline's balance in Europe is torn apart. Austria was the bulwark, the centerpiece of the balance, protecting all of Central Europe against the other great powers without being too expansionist themselves. With the fall of Austria, we would see Prussia, France and Russia competing for ultimate domination in Europe. In the meantime, Britain watches from their island, wondering how all has gone so wrong on the continent, and how they could have possibly prevented this mess. Following this course of events, it is quite possible that Britain allies itself with Prussia in an attempt to combat the increasingly assertive powers of France and Russia. The balance of power in Europe is destroyed by the year 1848, about 50 years earlier than in our own timeline. The fall of Austria would mark the end of the post-Napoleonic era and would begin a new era of renewed inter-European competition. So, to finish off this Eurocentric scenario, what has happened to the rest of the world that is dramatically different? Quite little actually. Britain was the European power that was most involved with the rest of the world between 1815 and 1848, while the others were mostly focused on European affairs. Britain simply still does Britain stuff. They consolidate control over most of the world's economy and oceans, they open up Chinese markets, they conquer India, they take advantage of Latin America, etc. During the 30 years that Europe was distrustful, but relatively stable, Britain had their hands free to act across the world, as the other European powers were too busy competing with each other on the continent. Only in 1848 would Britain have to end their global look and refocus on Europe in an attempt to stop a European hegemon from emerging. But the final conclusion of this scenario I will leave up to you. Will Britain manage to blockade France and Russia into submission? Will France and Russia manage to divide the entire continent? Will either France or Russia completely stomp over the continent themselves? Will Prussia be the underdog who, thanks to British assistance, leads the minor German states to victory, forming an enlarged Germany? Or maybe the conclusion to this scenario is more anticlimactic, and personal vendettas and balance of power politics will ensure the continued European conflict for decades to come, with no clear victor coming out on top. All of these are valid conclusions to this scenario, although some are more likely than others. But the point of this scenario is that from this point forwards, the Europe as we know it doesn't exist anymore. Diplomacy has once again failed, and war is now upon us. And that's it for this scenario. If you liked it, consider leaving a like and a comment, since engagement really helps the channel grow. Even just commenting hi helps the channel out massively. As always, to see more content like this, consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss the next video. And a special thanks to these patrons who make it possible for me to continue to make more and better videos and to dedicate more time to making videos over work. To support me, consider clicking the link in the Patreon in the description. You will receive early access to videos whenever I complete them myself, as well as being added to this animation. Thank you all for watching, and goodbye.